Welcome to the Raymond AMA School of Business alumni webinar with Professor Karen Locke today. The topic is managing conflict, not avoiding it. My name is Eliza Parrish, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement for the Mason School of Business at the College of William & Mary. As many of you who've been with us before know, we offer these webinars to you as part of our pledge to provide you with opportunities for lifelong learning and professional development. A little bit of housekeeping. Please note, sound for the webinars come through Adobe Connect. There is no call-in number. If you're having difficulties with sound, one thing you could try is logging out and then back in. As always, we will take questions. Please enter them into the chat. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Karen Locke. Many of you know Karen. She is the Pat and Barbara Walsh Professor in Leadership and Ethics at the School of Business Administration at the College of William & Mary. She has an honors degree in psychology from the University College London University and a PhD in organizational behavior from the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. Karen has published 2 books and numerous academic articles on organizational behavior. Her research and teaching interests include organizational behavior and management, leadership, organizational development and planned change, leading and managing teams, and qualitative research methodologies. She is also the winner of the college's Thomas Jefferson Teaching Award, which is an enormous honor here. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Professor Locke with my enormous thanks.
Thank you, Liza, for that introduction. And thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many faces. Actually, I can't see faces. I can see little tiny icons, but it's wonderful to see so many names that are familiar to me. I hope everyone's really well today. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about a topic near and dear to my heart, conflict. We started by putting up this poll for you, and I kind of skewed things by putting that nice little, having the topic be about avoiding. And so it looks like, as of right now, as you can see, the majority of you think there is much more work happening to keep ourselves away from engaging in conflict in the workplace than there is work happening to engage it directly. And you're right in that. When polled about or asked about the extent to which people pursue conflict in the workplace or the extent to which they do things to avoid it, and this poll was about going out of your way, people are also asked if they ever call in sick because they don't want to be in the same place as another employee that they're having difficulties with, and the numbers there are fairly significant as well. Thank you for the poll, Karen. What we actually find is that it's I'm having some technology issues. Excuse me one moment. See, you need the technology else, otherwise you press buttons and nothing happens. Actually, what the Human Capital Group found was that it was 67% who said that they had gone out of their way deliberately to avoid interacting with a colleague of theirs, with a peers, whether it was someone who perhaps lashed out at them because of a delay that that person had no control of, or sort of some way caught up in not being responsive to each other. But so conflict avoidance is fairly endemic in the workplace. And what I'd like to do today is spend a little bit of time really thinking about how we can deal with conflict more productively. And I'll share, I grew up in a household where the prevailing style for engaging with conflict was one of avoidance. My parents did not bring up issues that were issues of concern to them in the marriage. We knew that they existed as children because we would hear cupboard doors slam. But I would say as a household, we really didn't have a tremendous amount of facility. And so the skill is one that I think is personally significant, but I think that's also true, and the poll bears it out, that it's significant to a lot of people. So the way we're going to spend our time is I'm just going to do a little bit of setup, talking about how to think about this skill in being able to to engage in and confront. Actually, I was having a conversation with someone today who used the word carefront people, but to do how to think about what those skills entail. Then spend some time talking about why it is that conflicts heat up. And most people, when you ask them why it is that they go out of their way to avoid a conflict, will talk about not liking how it feels, which points to difficulties dealing with the heat that gets generated, the emotional underbelly of the issues that come up in conflict. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about why conflicts heat up. Then, moving to sort of actions that we can take, what is it that we can do to open conflict discussions so that we set them up for success as much as possible. And then finally, when we get into the middle of heat, how do we cool things down so that we end up with an outcome which, looking back, is the outcome that we would like. Okay, so let's get started. So first, the kinds of skills. Many years ago, I was designing a leadership development workshop, and the client for the workshop made the statement to me that what he did not want was for members of his organization to attend the training and end up learning a bunch of tricks. And what he was saying there was really something pretty profound. And what he was saying was that the development of these skills, these interpersonal, these interactional, these leadership skills, if you will, are really about broadening and sharpening who we are, what it is that we can bring to the table or bring to the situations that we engage in. And if we think of them as tricks, there are a couple of problems associated with that. One is it puts us in a manipulative place vis-a-vis the other parties. And if you are trying to manipulate me or I'm trying to manipulate you, you can smell it. So it's not terribly effective. The second is it makes us think about how we should act in fairly rigid terms versus thinking about skills as a broadening of our personal capacity, a broadening of the repertoire of possible responses we bring to situations, and in doing that, creating a full quiver of arrows so that in looking at what's happening, I can draw from it, you can select from it the kinds of responses that you think are going to be most helpful in that moment as it's unfolding. So really about broadening what we can bring to the situations that we encounter. So we'll get rid of any notion then of conflict skills as tricks that we play on people to get what we want. So one of the ways that I encourage and for myself think about this skill is that I have to develop a certain kind of muscle, and it's a muscle to be able to engage in interactions in a particular way. And that way is, I think of it as being in two places at once. So I'm having a conversation with you, and at the same time as I'm having this conversation with you, I'm paying attention to what is it I'm saying, how is it I'm carrying myself. Now, I can't see you at the other end, so I'm not able to read how it is that you're responding. But the skill of reflection in action, the term coined by an old D guru, Donald Schoen, speaks to that capacity. And so that it means that I'm acting not from a trick that I'm bringing out of a bag that I used in the past, that's my one trick, whenever someone says this kind of thing to me. But I'm looking at what's unfolding, I'm present to this, and looking at all of the available responses that I have to me and selecting the one that I think is going to be most productive for what I hope to achieve in our exchange. And there's plenty of time to do that. So research says that I'm probably speaking to you right now in the range of 125 to 170 words a minute. But I can actually think a lot faster than that. So that creates 75% of processing capacity that's available to me to do something productive with. Very often when we're in conflict situations, we do something non-productive with that, thinking about all of those things that come up, when we're taught active listening, thinking about what's the next thing that I'm going to say to force my point of view on you, or thinking about all the reasons that what you're saying makes no sense. So I have all of that processing capacity available. And we talk about developing conflict skill. It's developing the muscle to let me be in two places at once and let me be choiceful in how I respond. All right? So with that perspective, then, let's move on to thinking about why conflicts heat up. And there's quite a lot on this slide. I'm sorry for that. But there being a lot on the slide in part makes the point. So what I said, or what I had on that first slide in talking about what I would cover was, in talking about why conflicts heat up, put a hint out there that it's because they shift and expand. So have you ever been in a conversation with someone, the conversation's got a little bit hot, and you've thought to yourself, we're no longer talking, something else is going on here. There's a lot more sort of not being said, and what's not being said seems to be really making the situation much more difficult to deal with. So that sense points to the fact that when we're having a conversation about, let me pick one from my experience. I'll pick one from last night. When I'm having a conversation about emptying the dishwasher, right? The topic on the table is emptying the dishwasher. And actually, so let me be more specific. I'm emptying the dishwasher. It's Tuesday night. I emptied the dishwasher on Sunday night. I emptied the dishwasher on Thursday night. So when I open the dishwasher and see it full of clean dishes on Tuesday, what I have as a topic for discussion is emptying the dishwasher. But of course, I've got a whole lot more going on than that. Who does he think he is that I'm the one that has to do the job, or one of the jobs that everybody hates? I always do the jobs that everybody, that both of us, that the kids all hate in this family. And so in addition to the issue of emptying the dishwasher, I now am telling myself a story, a broader story. And that story includes, who does he think he is, or who does he think I am in this relationship? I'm the dishwasher emptier. Well, if I'm the dishwasher emptier, then I can also take that to mean I'm the one that does the menial chores. So in addition to the topic of emptying the dishwasher, what's also being talked about is who we are to each other, who we are in this relationship, who gets to do what, who doesn't get to do what, and what that means for how we think about each other. The other thing that's on the table in emptying the dishwasher is, what does that mean about who I am? Am I the maid? If I'm the maid, then I'm really not happy with that idea of who I am. So there can be identity and face issues brought into it. And then in addition, also process issues. How do we decide who empties, or how often, what our pattern of dishwasher emptying is? So there's a pretty trivial, but in my experience comes up pretty frequently, example of how a topic which is a pretty neutral topic also has different dimensions to it, different layers to it. And those layers invite us to tell stories which can generate some heat. So let's go to a workplace example. Say you're in a meeting, and on the table for discussion is selection amongst a set of candidates for a role on your team. And the discussion unfolds, and you make some statements about the individual that no one else picks up. You make a second statement that isn't picked up in the conversation. And people are picking up on other statements and elaborating them, but you notice that essentially your statement hasn't been picked up. So now I start wondering, I'm the one that's been making these statements, no one is picking up on that. What does that mean about who I am to these other people? Does my point of view count less? Am I less of a person now? How are we going to decide? Are we going to vote? Is my point of view going to be counted in how we make this decision? So the more layers there are to a conflict, to an issue, I beg your pardon, and the more those layers involve issues of identity and issues of face, the more likely the conflict is going to get hot. I did a training about 3 months ago, and one of the issues, it was a director of marketing, and that director of marketing essentially served as a consulting arm to other divisions of this company. And part of the issue was use of the marketing division's resources, and that director made decisions about who got marketing resources and how much of her marketing resources were made available to the other divisions. And there was a lot of tension around being the one that didn't have marketing resources available to them. And the marketing director in this instance felt that the challenge to the way that she allocated resources was a challenge to her ability, a challenge to her position as the director of marketing who made those decisions. So with that, we're in a training, and you could just feel the heat going higher and higher and higher in the room. And as you listened to the conversation, what you heard was, who are we to each other, and what demands can we make of each other, what responsiveness can we expect of each other, and who are each of the parties relative to power and status, and what the roles that they occupy mean, and what demands they can make of each other based on those roles. So to the extent that conflicts have layers of relationship issues and identity issues, they become much more heated. Here I'd like to put up our next poll. This scenario is, so you can't take the multiple choice making professor out of the interaction. This is actually an example from someone whose identity has been disguised, but who came as a speaker to my class that I taught recently on managing conflict. And the speaker was the CEO, and we'll call her Linda. She talked about her stepping down from the role and what was involved in that stepping down from the role. And so the scenario that I presented and asked you to poll on addresses that. So this is how I framed it. In a description of conflict with her board, one CEO, Linda, described the conflict between herself and her board on how to grow the company. Linda wanted to take a more conservative path towards growth and actually had been pursuing that, while the board wanted to take on some risk and pursue a more aggressive growth strategy. As quarter after quarter's projected goals were not met, those differences became more and more salient. As this happened, Linda reported the conversation shifted to whose voice, hers or the board's, was going to have final say on the company strategy. What goals are evident in this shift? So as you see you're filling out, you can't go wrong here, because certainly who they are to each other is on the table. Certainly what it means to be a CEO, what it means to be a board member relative to autonomy, decision rights, right to influence is on the table, and as well how it is that we go about making decisions. So I kind of like the all of the above. But what it should do then is sort of highlight that conversations, which were conversations about progress being made on strategic direction and how what was happening there, how that over time became a conversation. This wasn't an explicit conversation. The CEO, Linda, understood that in being challenged as expected growth fell a little bit short about the decisions that she had taken, Linda came to feel, if I go back to my prior slide, started telling herself the story that what was at issue here was her having the authority that she understood came to the role of being CEO, that her job was to make the decisions, the board could challenge and question, but in the pushback that she was receiving to her, it turned into an issue of what it meant to be the CEO, and whether or not if she changed her path, then that meant that she was giving up the decision right. So in just that sort of description that I've given, you can see that what happens when identity and relationship issues come on the table, it tends to have us sort of become more rigid in the positions that we hold, and that's not terribly productive for the exchange. And as it happens, I think I mentioned, this ended up with the resignation because from the CEO's perspective, they no longer were being allowed to exercise the role that they understood, that Linda understood that she held in the organization. So that's sort of to underscore the point that conflict is multi-layered, it's incredibly dynamic. So as we initiate, say something, that gets interpreted. The other party starts telling themselves a story about what that issue that you've raised is, and based on that, responses. And that story can be a story that's intellectual. They must think I'm really stupid, I articulate it, or it could be a story of just, this doesn't feel good and I'm going to lash out. So the story is felt rather than crystallized in some way. And because conflict is dynamic and shifts, and because those shifts can add layers of significance to the parties involved, they get out of hand. So one of the things that we can do to be more effective, to work in that space between what is happening right now, is use a heuristic like the trip model to be vigilant for when relationship in particular and identity issues are creeping into the discussion, or when we see ourselves feel ourselves heating up, or see it in other people, because now we're paying attention both to what's happening in the space in each of us, the space between the interactants, as well as what it is that we're trying to accomplish. We're working that muscle. If I see relationship and identity issues there, then I can sort of adjust. I can take a step back. I can not make an accusation, for example, to my husband, such as, right, even though I desperately want to say, you always leave me to empty the dishwasher. I know that always word is one that is saying something about the kind of person he is, and that's going to invite a response that's going to just get us escalating up. So if I'm aware of that, then I can not be a trigger for it in what comes out of my mouth, and as well see where it might be going on with other people and make adjustments with that. So turning to our next issue then, in terms of taking practical action, how can we open conflict discussions? The research suggests that how we begin, that beginning time, is the most precarious one. So if we can set a conversation up for likelihood that the relational, we can never take the relationship and the identity issues away, but we can make them non-problematic. So if I can make who I am to you feel like we're equals in this, then it's not going to be problematic, and it's not going to generate heat. If I can make you feel, and I can sort of draw on myself to feel that the kind of person that's showing up in your eyes and in my eyes is one that I can feel positive about, then it's going to be unlikely that it's going to escalate. So I have up on the poll here, go back to Linda, our CEO, and because one of the stories, one of the aspects she talked about was that, and she never did open the conversation, was that during these board meetings she noticed that several board members, and it was the same board members repeatedly, did nothing but challenge her. So there were few recommendations, few explanations that she offered, few areas of discussion where she felt they were actively engaging her to productively either understand what was going on or to support. But it was always challenging. So I've set that up as a scenario. Linda concluded that several members of the board did not support her because at the last and current meeting, this same few members only offered criticisms of her strategy. Let's say Linda decides to open a conversation with them. Which of the following statements appeal to you as a way Linda might engage them? So I'm beginning to feel that several of you don't have confidence in me. I'm probably reading more into your behavior than necessary. Your criticisms show you question my leadership. Why are several of you calling my judgment into question? So see how you're filling out. So the majority of you are staying away from options C and D. Your criticisms show that you question my leadership. Why are several of you calling my judgment into question? And that's exactly right, because what's happening if your response, if those are your response, is that you are telling them what story they are telling themselves about you. You're essentially reading their minds. And certainly when you use a question, why are several of you calling my judgment into question? If you want to put the issue on the table, you can do that. It's likely going to have a response that's an escalating response. So why are several of you calling my judgment into question? Because, Karen, I have serious questions about your judgment, as is shown as it's playing out in what's happening in the company. And so that just invites the escalation. And if that, we can do a little bit of a softer start out by keeping it not about their story and my reading of their minds, but me sharing what's going on in me, then the likelihood that it's going to escalate is a little bit less. If you're very comfortable working in heat, you can challenge directly. If, though, what you want is less heat, then it's useful to keep it in your space and have it much more about you. So those are those I questions and those I statements. Thank you, Karen. So I like A, that's a personal preference. And because it shares what the story I'm telling myself about what's happening is. I'm probably reading more into your behavior than necessary, keeps it in my space. What's nice about that is it's tentative. As a setup, inviting discussion. So in terms of principles, here are some, and again, they don't have to be in any particular order, but it's useful, and certainly in the Crucial Conversations framework, to let other people understand how it is that you are understanding what they are doing, as long as you own that understanding as yours. So how the story I'm telling myself about the situation is my story. It's not the truth of the situation, because you have your story as well. And so I'm making a much more modest claim from my point of view, though I'm putting it out there. So tell the story. I'm beginning to feel that several of you don't have confidence in me. So having set up the trick, I'll share that the does that surprise you actually is a trick. We had a gentleman work with us here at the Mason School several years ago, and Art was an executive coach for Goldman Sachs, my memory serves me well. And one of the things that Art used to suggest is that what you don't want, right, is to open a conversation by just dumping something in front of people. That you want to put something in front of people and you want to invite them to come back and join you in that conversation. And so Art loved this question, and does that surprise you? And questions are great things I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but it creates an invitation for the other party to respond to your story that you've owned is yours. So tell your story, share your facts. What are you basing your story on? You and I can have different stories. We're in trouble if we have different facts, right? So, and in sharing the facts, I could say, that's the third time, right, in the last 5 days that I've been the one to empty the dishwasher. Or I could say, since Thursday, I've been the one to empty the clean dishes 3 times. So if I can use my best pass the salt language, and that's, would you please pass the salt, I can take emotion out of that. And then the third is to always make sure that you ask for what you want. So one possibility for Linda, and again, these aren't prescriptions, back to sort of tricks and tips. Here's a way of thinking about it. I share the facts. Mary, Paul, Tom, you have repeatedly questioned my decisions. I'm beginning to feel that several of you don't have confidence in me. Does that surprise you? Maybe there's some conversation. And then what I'd really like to do is to understand your broader concerns. And I can go on because it's important that we all are on the same page with regard to the company's strategy. So having a soft start, being a little bit tentative, having the distinction between the facts and the story, the interpretation that I'm telling about the facts, and recognizing then that you may have a different story that you're telling, and looking for a way to have a conversation about those different perspectives is a good way to open up what could be a potentially hot conversation. And then now the last piece, when conflict gets too hot, you may recognize the gentleman on the right-hand side. That is Steve Slater, the JetBlue flight attendant who went out in a blaze of glory, but also ended up unemployed and serving probation. So I said before, when we were talking about the example of Linda, and when it became in who had the right or who had decision rights over the company's strategy and how those decisions were being made, and her relationship with the board, that what happened then was that she felt that relative to any given decision, what was at stake wasn't only decision, so not only this particular investment, but if her recommendation was to invest this amount versus this plus amount, if she didn't hold to her recommendation, that meant she was giving up decision rights. So it just was much more loaded. And when those emotions are in play, it tends to make us much more rigid. The second thing is, when those emotions are in play, we are in what increasingly neurobiologists call our hot processing system. So we distinguish between cool processing and hot processing. Hot processing is essentially, think of it when our flight and fight, I got it in the wrong order, when fight and flight comes in, then what that does is sort of force us into hot processing, where how we know how to defend ourselves takes over. So it's very efficient. It's also really very rigid. So when we're hot, one of the things we want to do is to get out of that rigid processing where essentially our instincts, our bodies have taken over, and to get back into, can we see what's happening, thinking about, because we've got all the time, thinking about what's unfolding and making good choices. And when a conflict is escalating, the best place to start is with ourselves. And what the crucial conversations folks suggest is this question. I use it regularly. These two questions, I find them incredibly centering. Ask yourself, what is it that you want for yourself, for others, for the relationship, and then what you really don't want. If I think of those questions in the context of emptying the dishwasher, it probably helps me stay married. Because rather than the response, which in this moment, right, I really want to lash out, I rather think about what would be a productive response for the relationship ongoingly, and for dealing, actually getting a change in dishwasher emptying behavior. So the other thing that happens is when you give the hot processing system a question, they don't know what to do with it. And so there's a switch from hot back to cool processing. Oh, you've put a problem in front of me. I have to think about this. What is it that I want? And as soon as that switch happens, then the heat starts coming down. So first is bring yourself down, and as you bring yourself down and you get clarity on, do I not care about the relationship in this moment and I want to go for it, or do I want to make sure that the relationship is preserved? How do I respond? So one of the questions that came up was, can you suggest some skills in dealing with conflict that has a power dichotomy, such as between a boss and an employee? So in that one, what I want is to raise the issue. What I want for the relationship, right, is for the relationship to remain intact. And what I want also is that at the end of it, that the person that the boss feels like I did a good thing in raising the issue. So if I want to bring an issue to the boss, then what's going to come up in the slide following this one would probably be most helpful. So if you just let me go through this, I'll get to how to raise issues up the power gradient. So the first, when someone else is on the other side is hot, the first is do no harm. And the best way we can do no harm actually is to just give them space, is allow it to be about them, to say nothing, and in particular not to use a yes but to engage in active listening. So if you had class with me, it's very likely that you heard me tell the story of how I went to do a training when I was in graduate school with a group of hostile GE security guards, and how through 20 minutes of active listening, and only active listening, got them to the place where they wouldn't even sit down at the table, to where they said, well, if you're willing to listen to us, we're willing to listen to what you have to say. So the first thing is to hold on to our impulse to want to engage and just let it be the other person's space. The second, and this picks up the question, in raising, in all situations, but particularly when we are raising a conflict issue up, make the mutual purpose salient. So what it is that will come out of this discussion that would be helpful for both people. So we both want these reports to be accurate and on time. We both want to offer the best service to our internal clients. We both want to make sure that customers feel that we are responsive to their needs. And I'd like to talk about something then that I think will help us achieve that. So emphasizing mutual purpose at the beginning, the middle, the end, as often as you feel as we go through sort of these patterns of this dance of action, interaction, response, back and forth, as we engage that spot, coming back and saying we both want the same thing in as many different ways as you can is really useful. And so when you're dealing with the boss, the startup would be around framing that mutual purpose. I'd like to talk to you about something that I think would be helpful in us being able to. And that involves you thinking about how your issue connects then to your boss's concerns, and using that as the frame to have the conversation. So if your boss did a better job of including you on information that you needed to complete those reports so that they could be done on time and accurately, then the setup is, I think this would help our department's work products be of a better quality and better received by the organization. And then you can move into a more recent episode. So the last report I had to work on, in order to get it done, I had to ABC. One of the components was your input into. That came on. The consequence of that was. And what I'd like to do then is to find a way, what is it that I could do that would make it easier for you to help me get the report done on time. So having a way of engaging that stresses the mutual purpose and then gets into how can we figure this out together so that it's about inquiry and learning, really helps bring down the conflict. And sometimes when someone is actively disagreeing, going to using language like walk me through why you believe that, can, as they feel that they're listened to and as they're elaborating, what their facts and their story are can help bring them down. And then the other is to always find ways to underscore that there are different perspectives, different point of view. Because if I disagree with you, I'm convinced that, right, my perspective, my point of view, my understanding of the situation is the one that anyone with half a brain would have. The problem is the person on the other side is thinking exactly the same thing. And one of the things that can help loosen the tension is to say, well, these are the facts that I'm paying attention to. The story I'm telling myself is, from what you're saying, it seems to you that you're paying attention to these facts and also these, or with these same facts, your understanding is that we actually should be shifting our strategy at this point in time. So making sure that those two different perspectives is there. So let me see, I have another question. My team has been together for 10 years. We are really struggling hitting our goals. How do we get back on track? One of our teammates is very angry and upset. So I assume that's one of the teammates who is angry and upset about not achieving goals. So if I go back to that, then I think that one of the place that I would start is to sort of walk through where we are relative to our goals. And we had a speaker here who talked about getting ugly on the table. So we can put that ugly on the table and then ask people to share their stories about why it is that they believe that we're not achieving our goals. And from those stories, be able to separate then, right, what are the facts and what are people's understandings? And there may be stories in there that you have no control of. There may be stories of their relative to relationships with each other, in terms of being more or less responsive to each other. And you can get those on the table, and when they're on the table in out in the open, then that's a much healthier conversation. Because one of the things that we know about avoidance, when you avoid conflict, it doesn't go away. It leaks out somewhere else. So the things that the stories that people are telling themselves about what's going on and why the team is missing its goals and whose fault it is and whose fault it isn't are happening outside in hallways or outside in homes. And a constructive thing to do is to bring them in so that people can put together their different stories. And part of it also is allowing the team to talk about their frustrations. I think we undervalue how important talking through the frustrations are. But then we need to distinguish between talking through the frustrations and then identifying what people see as the reasons for those frustrations, and those having conversations about the stories people are telling themselves about the reasons as well. Let me see. What about between people? Another question. Who are at different levels in the firm, for instance, VP and manager. Often the VP will feel she will not be pleased that someone below them initiated the conflict. Yeah, and I think a lot of that is going to be, hi Troy, a lot of that is going to be dependent on the culture of the organization. Obviously, it's going to be a much more difficult thing to do in an organization where it is never done versus in an organization where it is a part of the regular conversation. And all that I can suggest is to go to that mutual purpose place as much as possible. The other way is to think about maybe it's not a conversation. You know, maybe it's a short piece of writing emphasizing what the value of dealing with the issue that you want to raise up might be. Some reasons that some ways you think about it, how you understand the situation, what potential benefits, if there are obviously some calculations, some visible benefits that you can show, putting all of that, but doing it in a writing mode versus in a face-to-face mode. Some people, as you mentioned, just get a little uncomfortable because who that issue of relationship is at play, right? Who am I, and then particularly feeling it face to face. Some people process better if it comes to them in writing. So just thinking through what would be the medium through which that individual is most likely to hear your message, and maybe even talking to other people in the organization about it. We never have to act individually, right? We have to draw on all of the resources available to us. So, Woody, I can see a question from can there be value in adding heat to a situation? For example, is it a good strategy to combat passive aggressiveness or denial? Passive aggressiveness is tough because passive aggressiveness is just always tough to deal with, right? So that the way I'm going to get what I want, or the way that I'm going to demote you in the relationship, is to withhold something from you that you care for. But certainly adding heat is really good. It's actually interesting, going back to the story of Linda. One of the things that Linda learned on reflection was that she had overlearned. She actually had a really hot temper, and one of the things that she had learned over her career as a manager was to contain it, right? So when she wanted to lash out, to contain it, and to keep an even keel. Now, in a turnaround situation, which was the situation that Linda entered, that was really useful because it gave people confidence. The problem was, as the turnaround, as the company was stabilized and then things switched to growth, the board members that she was having difficulties with read her equanimity as a lack of concern for growth not hitting the targets that had been set. So in reflection, not actually getting a little bit hot signaled that she didn't care. And we tend to think that emotions are bad. Actually, emotions have a lot of information. They can lead us if we're not aware of what they are. But emotions can signal, yeah, this is really important. I care about this, and so I want you to care about that. So it's adding some heat is a good thing to do to show people that this is something that you care about. Whereas that, where to insert it in sort of the history of the engagement is something that you're going to need to make a judgment call on. And then we are getting close. I had one more thing that I just wanted to point to in terms of working in that space where things are getting hot and not going well. So I'm sure I certainly have been in interactions where you think, oh, this is just heading south fast, right? This is not what I wanted to happen. And or we just keep saying the same thing again and again and again. So I say this, you say that, it's like we're broken records. One of the things then, if it's really not productive, that you can do is to hit reset by stepping out. And by step out, you stop having the conversation you're having, and instead you offer a reflection on on not what you're talking about, but how you're talking about it. So I just like to step back for a minute. I don't know about you, but what I hear is you and I saying exactly the same thing over and over again and not getting anywhere. So I'd like to find a way out of that. So you can just step out of the heat, right? Or you can just say, I'm feeling like I can't hear what you're saying right now, and I'd like to be able to hear it, so I just want to step out. And then you can even literally step out. The other is to come back to that mutual purpose, right? So we both want. And then finally, to try and scale things down. So I don't want to suggest that you don't have any decision input here. What I do want to talk about is relative to this decision, your rejection of my point of view that we should make this investment. So scaling things down by using contrasting statements is another way that we can kind of get a handle on this. Hi, Beulah. Another question. So I'm coaching a cross-functional teams transition from a hierarchical, role-based methodology to a flatter way of working. The SVP in charge of this cross-functional team is resisting the changes and is overtly influencing the team's decision-making. So I assume this means that instead of letting the team now have decision-making be more decentralized, the senior vice president is suggesting what those decisions should be. The leadership is aligned with the change and has assigned me to lead the transition. The senior vice president in charge has stated that he is not open to any changes as the team is comfortable. How do I open the discussion with the senior vice president? Would appreciate pointers on how, what, where, and who else would be ideal to include in this conversation. Gosh. So I hope some of what we've talked about in terms of opening, finding the mutual purpose, what is at stake, and part of what is at stake, right, is sort of what is the story that the company is telling for the reason to going to a much more agile structure. And it's probably going to be a story associated with speed, increasing speed, and probably also a story associated with increasing creativity. But going to that purpose to frame it, and then seeing if you want to have a direct engagement with that senior vice president, framing it that way. The other way, and I like that you're thinking in who else, is sort of who else are stakeholders to this change? Because it's not just an individual behavior pattern, right? It's a whole shift in how the organization is trying to do business. Who else is a stakeholder? And if perhaps you're not the one, and this sort of maybe speaks back to the prior question about raising an issue, maybe if you're not the one having the conversation, you can identify other stakeholders who would have a better ear of the senior vice president and have them lay some groundwork for you in doing that, so that you broaden who engages on this issue. Just something to think about. So, question, hi, at what point do you just send that email? And so I just wanted to like, never make it be an email. Just never make it be an email. I'm typically conscious of stepping away from certain situations, typically to not escalate even further. Plus, I'm better at just writing down my thoughts than speaking them. Because, yeah, and I think, you know, knowing yourself, Jessie, that makes perfect sense and is a terrific strategy. So writing down my thoughts allows me to exhale, some vent, and then move on. But at what point do I just hit send and let the chips fall where they fall? So I give you two answers. One is, and I used to tell this story, my sister would say, always make sure you have your drop dead money. And in English culture, drop dead money is me being able to tell you to go and drop dead. Understanding when what you are facing in the situation is so unproductive for you, but out of cool processing, not out of hot processing, but it seems in writing things down, because that is definitely a cool processing mode, because you have to think about what you're writing. But that if you come to that point, then you can just send that email. But again, I'm not sure that I would have it be an email. My son works for Ferrari North America, and he described someone sending a career-ending email deliberately, and that's sort of, I think of our flight attendant, right? The problem is you have something concrete then in the system, and one of the things you want to think about is how would I feel about that email ending up, and think of all of the places that it might end up. So I think you have to ask yourself that question. Going in and having the face-to-face conversation, if you feel and having some heat around it because you care about it, is perfectly legitimate. But the heat has to be connected to, right, what it is that's happening that's interfering with what your unit or the company is trying to achieve, so that the purpose is aligned, what is happening is concretely articulated, and your frustration comes out in the legitimate story based on how you understand, or the story that you understand to be a legitimate one of what is going on that's problematic in the organization.
The email is one-sided too.
I'm sorry?
Email is one-sided too.
Yes, yeah. You don't get the other party's perspective. Hi, Lee. Question: how do you reinforce the importance of constructive conflict in the team reaching its full potential? So one of the things that actually a lot of managers, organization leaders are doing in the leadership development programs that are a part of us is that whenever they take time in regularly scheduled meetings, and I don't know if this might be a quarterly update meeting, a monthly meeting, whatever, to set around some time for organization development. And some managers have a theme that lasts for 6 months, a theme that lasts for a quarter, and what they do is share some really short, some pithy readings, and I'd be happy to give a couple of suggestions for super short readings that I think are useful ones, as well as some longer ones that Liza can distribute. So that part of our agenda, our regularly scheduled agenda, is talking about things that we think will make us be more effective. And dealing with conflict constructively can be one of those things. But I think it works much better if it's a part of, or if part of the culture, that the climate for working that you establish is one where we spend some time and energy and some of our valuable resources focused on how we might work better as a team. And that just becomes part of our routine, our regularly scheduled patterns of activities. So with that, we managed to use up almost a full hour of time. Thank you so much for your questions.
And Karen, I'd like to thank you as well, too. I think this is a fascinating topic and fascinating conversation, because so few people are good at handling conflict or realizing how it can be used to the company benefit. We do have a few more questions coming in. As always, if you have questions, keep sending them in, and we will do our best to get them answered. And Professor Locke has agreed to send some reading material, so I look forward to sending that out. And I'm going to say here in front of her former students and other alumni that I think the next Professor Locke book should be Putting the Ugly on the Table. So with that, thank you so much, everyone.
George, I agree, absolutely.
Well, I had the microphone away from her, but she said, George, I agree, absolutely. So at any rate, thank you so much to all who attended and spent an hour with us. Thank you to the team behind us, and thank you so much to Professor Locke. Bye-bye.